Great. Well, it's 12:05. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Taylor Fravel, Director of the Security Studies Program, and I'm delighted to welcome you all today to our Wednesday seminar series, and especially delighted to welcome Kristen Van Brusgaard from Norway, who's going to speak to us about explaining change in Russian nuclear strategy. So this is very much a talk taking SSP back to its roots from sort of the heart of the Cold War days. Dr. Van Brusgaard is a postdoctoral fellow, which I've learned is also an assistant, the same sort of as an assistant professor of political science at the University of Oslo, where she's part of the Oslo Nuclear Project. She's previously been a nuclear security postdoctoral fellow and a Stanton Nuclear Security predoctoral fellow at CSEC and at Stanford, a research fellow with the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, and a senior security policy analyst in the Norwegian Armed Forces. She holds a PhD in defense studies from King's College in London, as well as an MA from that other security studies program down in Georgetown University. She's a certified language officer in the Norwegian Army. And her article, Russian Nuclear Strategy and Conventional Inferiority, won the 2020 Amos Pullmurder Prize from the Journal of Strategic Studies. So Dr. Van Brusgaard, welcome to MIT SSP. We're really delighted to have you with us today and to learn more about your research. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fravel, and thank you so much for the invitation and opportunity to address this forum. So I'm very excited that I'll be able to present some of the key content of my book project that I'm working on. That's based on my dissertation work. It's not all completely polished and completely finished. There are some parts of this that I'm still writing, but that just means that I am very much looking forward to your questions and comments regarding my methodology as well as my findings. So I'll just delve straight into it. The puzzle, or the motivation really for this paper started around, well, 2014, which was when I started my PhD, and which was also the year that we all know in which Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. And this event in particular spurred some significant concern and debates within Western security policy circles regarding Russian foreign policy ambitions and regarding Russian nuclear strategy, that is the way in which nuclear weapons would potentially contribute to serving those Russian foreign policy ambitions. And quite rapidly after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and Russian operations in Ukraine, or war in Ukraine, a lot of the Western debate about Russian nuclear policy started depicting a Russian nuclear strategy as potentially coercive, that Russia would pursue nuclear coercion against, or potentially could pursue nuclear coercion against either its neighboring states or potentially also NATO states. So, the puzzle or the debate that arose around that time in this period when I started my PhD research was centered around questions regarding whether Russia would use its nuclear weapons to coerce us. I write us, that meaning NATO states. Before then, there had also been concern, particularly in policy circles, regarding Russian nuclear strategy and elements in it that indicated a lowered nuclear threshold. But it was really after 2014 that the Western debate really went ballistic, I would say, with regard to the potential that Russia could make use of its nuclear weapons to produce the types of political outcomes it hypothetically could seek, for example, in Europe, and the typical scenarios that were debated related to Baltic countries and Russian aggression into Baltic countries, for example. So this policy debate really provided a motivation for delving deeper into this issue of what Russian nuclear strategy really was and how it had changed over time, which quite quickly brought me to what I found to be a more interesting puzzle, which was that Russian nuclear strategy has shifted most in periods of relatively benign external conditions, and that it really failed to change amid a severe deterioration of its external relations, that is in 2014 and after. And this paradox has been left unexplored really in the existing academic literature. So there has been much ink spilled on the current debate over Russian nuclear strategy and what it consists of, but I still feel that I have to say something about the state of the debate. So the US debate in particular, and the US policy debate in particular, has honed in really on how the United States should adopt its nuclear policy to adjust for this new reading of Russian nuclear strategy as one of coercion. And the key proposition of these US strategists is that the Russian threshold for nuclear weapons use is very low, that Russia would use nuclear weapons early and in a limited conflict to secure limited gains. For example, gains gained in a territorial fait accompli in a Baltic state, the typical scenario. And that Russia would do so by way of forcing the adversary to accept submission to Russian demands rather than to risk further nuclear escalation. And this de-escalation argument has become, or did become, very predominant in the US policy debate, although it really didn't systematically investigate the mechanisms that had produced this change, this apparent change in Russian nuclear strategy. The key, if you examine the propositions or the analysis that put forward this interpretation of Russian nuclear strategy, the key variable that seems to have produced, according to this interpretation, change in Russian strategy is changing political intentions, as observed from Russian foreign policy communication from 2007 onwards. And it's typically the Putin speech in Munich in 2007 that a lot of people highlight when they talk about when Russian foreign policy ambitions or objectives changed. Furthermore, this de-escalation interpretation of Russian nuclear strategy assumes that Russia views nuclear weapons as useful coercive tools to pursue revisionist goals, and also that Russia presumes its ability to control nuclear escalation. And in addition, this interpretation of Russian nuclear strategy tends to observe nuclear indicators of strategy or conflate different indicators of nuclear strategy and conflate them also across time, ignoring really how Russian strategy has evolved over time. So this depiction of Russian strategy really provides a compressed image of what Russian nuclear strategy is. It doesn't depict the full range of strategic goals that Russia formulates for its nuclear weapons. And of course, there remains this significant debate about whether this compressed depiction is in fact a correct interpretation of Russian nuclear strategy. Obviously, Russian officials, for example, have repeatedly decried that this is not a correct interpretation of Russian strategy. So moving on, since 2014 and in the midst of this description of Russian nuclear strategy, many efforts have been tried to decipher and describe Russian nuclear strategy in a different way, including how it has evolved over time. And these alternative contributions focus on starting from the basics of understanding Russian strategy, such as understanding the Russian concept of deterrence and how it differs from Western concepts of deterrence, understanding the role and relevance of other key concepts that Russian military and civilian theorists debate, and understanding how that debate has evolved over time, and also understanding the role of conventional precision strike capabilities and how these affect Russian deliberations regarding nuclear weapons. And these efforts and debates are still ongoing and evolving, this debate about the real content of Russian nuclear strategy, including a current debate that's going on about how the new Russian concept of non-nuclear deterrence is already and will influence the role of nuclear weapons in Russian strategy in the future. But still, all of these contributions to the scholarly debate are largely descriptive of Russian strategy debates and of Russian strategy. They do not really engage with explaining why Russian strategy has evolved the way that it has, although some contributions contemplate some of the rationale behind the evolution of certain concepts. None engage in a systematic examination of theory-driven hypotheses regarding why Russia makes the nuclear strategy choices it does and why those choices have changed over time. So this is what I explore in my book, with a research question that hones in on examining what has produced change in Russian nuclear strategy in the post-Cold War era. So this research question then comprises two distinct elements. First, to determine in a systematic manner how Russian nuclear strategy has changed in this period, what aspects of it has changed and how. And then secondly, determining why it has changed, exploring complementary explanations for why. I define nuclear strategy as comprising decisions regarding nuclear capabilities, nuclear signaling, and nuclear declaratory strategy. That is official communication regarding the conditions under which Russia would consider using nuclear weapons. And I examine Russian strategy through a number of cases that are selected based on this Russian official communication of its nuclear intentions through the publication of military doctrines, which I see as impasses regarding the role that nuclear weapons play in producing Russian security. So it's the publication of Russian military doctrines that have produced this selection of cases, and then I assess these other indicators of nuclear strategy at those particular points in time as well. So I comprise nuclear strategy as several distinct decisions pertaining to doctrinal outcomes, capability outcomes, and signaling outcomes that can be picked apart and studied as part of this process of producing nuclear strategy outcomes. There are, of course, some analytical pitfalls associated with strategy and analysis. For example, assuming that these three aspects of strategy should comprise a coherent whole. In fact, my analysis also demonstrates how this is not necessarily the case, that declaratory strategy, capabilities, and signaling do not always comprise a coherent whole. There are cases or incidents where they seem to be at odds or in fact incoherent. But in turn, that also demonstrates the utility of breaking apart strategy into these three distinct indicators and seeking to trace how decisions are made with regard to each of those indicators. That provides a richer empirical basis from which to understand strategy decisions. So in order to explore this question of what explains Russian nuclear strategy and how it changes, I start from existing scholarly literature that provides insights into why strategy changes and why nuclear strategy changes. This will all be very familiar to this audience, evidently. For example, realist theory would posit that states would change their nuclear strategy according to changes in the balance of power or in the balance of threats. And there are some recent contributions to this debate, including that of Keir Lieber and Daryl Press, who argue that and Brendan Rittenhouse-Green, for that sake, who all argue that the nuclear revolution is a myth and that it did not inhibit states from consistently striving for superiority or continuing to compete in the nuclear domain. Other explanations focus on how technology may drive strategy change or innovation. This is linked to the theories regarding technological determinism or arms raising dynamics, where certain scholars predict and demonstrate that adversary technology, for example, or indigenous innovation may produce change in nuclear strategy. Other scholars, again, present company included, examine how domestic bureaucratic or organizational structures or mechanisms affect strategy or doctrine, including the impact of civil-military relations on strategy outcomes, as the potential destruction caused by nuclear wars makes the issue of civilian control perhaps particularly acute. The traditional approach within the scholarly tradition of nuclear strategy analysis has been to examine civilian control over nuclear policy through how states organize the command and control of nuclear weapons and whether they retain assertive or delegative control over nuclear weapons. But if one is more interested in how civilian control mechanisms affect the content of strategy and the content of doctrine, then other scholars have demonstrated how a lack of civilian oversight over, for example, US nuclear war planning. Post-Cold War, much nuclear scholarship has focused on variation in regional powers nuclear strategies and examined how a range of drivers, both internal factors and external factors, may produce strategy choices or posture choices. And this pertains to both the nuclear domain and the general military domain, or explaining change in military strategy. So in my examination of Russian nuclear strategy, I investigate how one external and one internal driver of change or mechanism affect strategy outcomes in Russia. And I hone in on how perceived threats as posed by the capabilities of potential adversaries affect strategy choices, and on how patterns of civil-military relations, the distribution of power between civilian authorities and military planners and policymakers, the structures and mechanisms for strategy decisions influence the content of strategy decisions. So originally this was conceived as an investigation of how perceptions of the balance of power and how civilian control over military policy affected Russian nuclear strategy choices, which in turn produced an argument that integrates how internal and external factors impact strategy outcomes. The key argument I make is that the Russian military enjoys significant autonomy in formulating nuclear strategy, particularly with relation to declaratory strategy and signaling, and to some extent also with relation to nuclear capabilities. This autonomy means that Russian nuclear strategy changes as military views of the correlation of military forces, and that is both nuclear and conventional forces, change. And adversely, that in periods of reduced autonomy, the impact of the shifting conventional nuclear balance of forces on strategy outcomes is reduced. This argument about the autonomy of the Russian military has significant implications for the content of Russian nuclear strategy. It produces what I call a functional nuclear strategy that is, first of all, in line with military assessments of the correlation of forces, that closely associates the planning for conventional and nuclear operations, and that retains then an emphasis on the potential warfighting options that nuclear capabilities provide. So I explore the relationship between these three variables, the dependent variable being nuclear strategy and two independent variables that are in some sense associated, military autonomy and the correlation of forces. through two hypotheses, where one posits that high autonomy produces change in the military technical requirements of deterrence because of the change in correlation of conventional nuclear forces, and where low autonomy produces change in the military political requirements of deterrence. I examine the dependent variable, that is strategy outcomes, by consulting these official documents, military doctrines, Russian military doctrines, as I mentioned, which is a comparable set of expressions of declaratory nuclear strategy, which makes it easy to trace change over time. I explore signaling and nuclear capabilities, primarily using Western sources or Western assessments of Russian nuclear capabilities, because Western sources provide this comparable data set of Russian nuclear capabilities in terms of these annual assessments published by the IISS Military Balance, as well as the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Nuclear Notebook. And then I augment this with details from Russian sources on capability developments. I examine military autonomy and civilian oversight by consulting Russian laws and regulations regarding key institutions that are engaged in strategy formulation and the division of labor between them. And then I trace the processes by which strategy decisions are made through reporting from Russian media regarding the processes that have taken place at these different points in time. So in the 1990s, in 2000, 2010, and 2020. And then I examined the correlation of forces, or that is Russian perceptions of the correlation of forces, by consulting Russian language archival sources, military theoretical journals, civilian journals, and statements by key officials in order to trace how Russian actors deem the correlation of forces to be evolving. And I use these indicators as listed on the slide. So these sources provide insights into the key concerns and considerations that play a role in Russian strategy decisions. That's not necessarily to say that these sources can provide insights into political leaders' thinking regarding decisions about nuclear weapons use, but it does provide insights into what deliberations, what processes, and what preferences influence the decision, nuclear strategy decisions that were taken at different points in time. I also explore some alternative explanations, that is how technological progress and economic opportunity have impacted strategy decisions at different points in time, and address these in each of the cases of Russian nuclear strategy that I examine. And this is just a brief depiction of the table of content, which describes how I examined these 4 cases of nuclear strategy, first from the early 1990s under President Yeltsin, then from 2000, which is strategy decisions that are taken in the midst of the transition between the Yeltsin and the Putin regime. Thirdly, nuclear strategy decisions taken under President Medvedev in 2010. And then finally, nuclear strategy decisions as taken under the Putin regime contemporaneously, that is in 2020. So I'll talk you through some examples of these cases and my findings in these cases in order to give you a taste of the trajectory of this story about Russian nuclear strategy. And for the sake of brevity, I start with my second case, really, which deals with Russian nuclear strategy in the year 2000. So from the main takeaways regarding Russian strategy in the 2000 case is that at this point in time, Russian nuclear strategy really changes quite radically as compared to the early 1990s, where Declaratory strategy changes significantly to convey a lowered nuclear threshold that is the result of a Russian perception of conventional inferiority as compared to potential adversaries such as Western militaries, and a total lack of Russian response options in the event that they should come under attack from Western militaries. And one of the quotes that I've included on this slide really just depicts the logic or rationale that Russian nuclear strategists put forward regarding the reasoning why Russia needs to lower its nuclear threshold. This is the result of significant military autonomy in formulating nuclear strategy at this point in time. After Yeltsin briefly entertained the idea of expanding civilian control over nuclear strategy, that idea or experiment really failed. And by the 2000s, early 2000s or late 90s and early 2000s, military actors and the Russian general staff in particular had established itself as the leading authority in nuclear strategy deliberations. It's really quite difficult to find civilian communities of nuclear strategy experts who have a say and an impact on nuclear strategy deliberations. And there is a process within the Russian Security Council that focuses on reformulating, reshaping Russian nuclear strategy in this period. And this process is in fact led by Vladimir Putin, who at that point in time is not yet elected prime minister or named president. He's still the head of the FSB and double hatting as the secretary of the Russian Security Council. But despite the fact that he leads this process of reformulating Russian nuclear strategy, the whole process is infested by and completely dominated by the general staff, who leads the working group responsible for reformulating nuclear strategy and who make a really great impact on the decisions that are taken as a result of this revision process. These results pertain to not only reformulating declaratory strategy, but also pertain to a sustained emphasis or a decision to preserve the full nuclear triad, which was a question that was basically up in the air in this period because of the severe economic situation Russia found itself in. And most Western analysts at this point in time were questioning the future of the Russian triad because most people assumed that Russia would not be able to afford to hold itself with a full nuclear triad. And also decisions regarding future sub-strategic nuclear capabilities, in part because these were deemed essential for Russia's ability to deter regional wars where they could face an adversary with superior conventional capabilities. And this change in strategy is evident also from Russian signaling in this period, where Russia, in a strategic exercise in the Western strategic direction, Zapad 1999, rehearses basically what we would now call a nuclear de-escalation strike. And in fact, the idea of nuclear de-escalation appears really for the first time in the Russian debate in this seminal article in 1999, written by some Russian military strategists associated with one of the general staff's research institutes. So we see this very significant impact or autonomy of military actors and the significant impact of their preferences on strategy outcomes through this high emphasis on the correlation of nuclear and conventional forces, and this significant concern with how this correlation of forces is severely disfavorable to Russia and the need to compensate in terms of nuclear strategy and lowering the nuclear threshold. If we move then to the third case that I write about, and these are just very brief and rudimentary depictions, then by 2010, Russian nuclear strategy becomes slightly more reserved in declaratory terms. I've included formulation from the Russian military doctrine in 2010, which introduces this formulation that's still part of Russian military doctrine today regarding how Russia would use nuclear weapons only in cases where the state's existence is under threat. But we also see in 2010 the start of nuclear capability modernization. So the coming to fruition of several of the decisions that were made in the previous case in around the year 2000 regarding the future nuclear triad, the future modernized nuclear triad. These decisions are the result of reduced military autonomy in this case around 2010. This is a period in which we've had a change of leadership, both in terms of the presidential seat, but also at the Russian Ministry of Defense and the General Staff, where the new leadership, the new defense minister Serdyukov and the new General Staff Chief Makarov are a pair installed to carry out significant overhaul and modernization of the Russian military force, including the nuclear force. And this change of leadership also includes several processes that are set to increase the efficiency of civilian control over military policy and over strategy decisions. Although several of those processes of increasing civilian control were not directly affecting nuclear strategy decisions, some of them did in fact impact nuclear strategy directly. And with regard to the declaratory strategy, for example, in this case, there is a substantial debate in Russia among military actors regarding the introduction of a clause of preemption in the military doctrine. This is removed at the final hours before or final days before the publication of the military doctrine. And as far as I've been able to determine, this removal of a preemptive clause from the Russian military doctrine is a result of increased civilian oversight and of direct political intervention in the formulations of the military doctrine. So does this increased political oversight, reduced military autonomy produce a reduced emphasis on the correlation of forces in Russian strategy? To some extent, it does. At least there are several examples of how military actors and security policy actors would advocate a strategy that allowed for more direct compensation of this still perceived conventional inferiority. Although Russia is by now heading in the direction of modernization, they haven't really made much progress on this yet. The only real progress they had made by 2010 was to introduce the Iskander missile that you see depicted on the map on this slide. But still sort of improved conventional capabilities, strategic conventional capabilities were still far into the future. So there is some evidence that these deliberations regarding the correlation of forces or the balance of nuclear and conventional forces have somewhat reduced impact on nuclear strategy decisions. It doesn't pertain to all parts of strategy, and there is still evidence of how military actors retain influence regarding the military technical parts of nuclear strategy, that is nuclear operations and formulating deterrence requirements. And by this point, there are also some interesting data points regarding how the implementation of civilian control over military policy is taking a different turn with regard to how actors from the security policy community, from the security services, are starting to dominate the institutions that are carrying out civilian control over military policy. So this raises a number of questions regarding the alignment of preferences among military actors on the one hand and among the civilians who are doing the controlling of these military actors on the other hand. If we move then to the final case, Russian nuclear strategy in 2020, this is still, I would emphasize, a work in process. So I'm hypothesizing somewhat regarding the formal processes of formulating nuclear strategy in this particular case, but evidently there are several aspects of Russian nuclear strategy that are quite evident to most observers these days. Declaratory strategy, the threshold for nuclear weapons use remains high, including in this new document that spells out the Russian Federation's deterrence policy. Despite this ever-expanding range of novel strategic capabilities that many observers are paying very close attention to, and I've included an illustration of some of these novel systems. Please excuse some of the Norwegian lingo on this depiction, but this is a depiction from 2020 that appeared in the Norwegian Intelligence Service's unclassified assessment that they publish on an annual basis. And we also see Russian nuclear signaling in this period increasingly intermingled with signaling of improving conventional capabilities. So the image with regard to Russian nuclear signaling as well is somewhat more dispersed or varied as compared to previous cases. I hypothesize, but this is a work in progress, so I'm still investigating, but my impression so far at least is that military autonomy has remained relatively high in this period, and that military actors are still given significant leeway in formulating nuclear policy, despite tightening of the grip of the Russian Security Council over military policy due to a number of organizational changes that have taken place in the period between 2010 and 2020. Still, the debates on the sort of the detail of nuclear strategy choices remains populated and dominated by military actors. There are still very few civilians who participate in these strategy deliberations. And the emphasis on the correlation of nuclear and conventional forces remains very high and a key determinant for nuclear strategy outcomes today. Seemingly, the rationale behind the range of the new Russian strategic systems remains closely associated with the perceived Russian need to overcome the conventional defensive systems that may inhibit Russian retaliatory capability. And we also see that this rhetoric regarding the correlation of forces has been adopted by the political leadership, including the rhetoric employed by Putin, who seems to be, when you study his statements quite closely, very well read into the precise formulations of the military doctrine, as well as the rationale as spelled out by military analysts. And his statements on nuclear preemption and how this is not a part of Russian doctrine is a very good example of this. And there is this sustained ambiguity in Russian doctrine, including with regard to the conditions under which, or the situation in which Russia would consider nuclear weapons use. And I've included a quote on the slide from this new deterrence policy document that was published in 2020 that conveys this uncertainty given the sort of already established certainty, in the sense that this document also reiterates that Russia would only use nuclear weapons when the very existence of the state is under threat. And there are also with regard to the very severe emphasis on the correlation of forces, there are these statements regarding the increased role and relevance of non-nuclear deterrent capabilities, including to deter non-nuclear threats. And a significant emphasis on, for example, the role of hypersonics and how they will have a very prominent role in the Russian concept of non-nuclear deterrence, as most recently spelled out by Defense Minister Shoigu. So the key findings, to sum them up, is that Russian nuclear strategy has changed incrementally and according to changes in Russian assessed correlation of forces. With regard to capabilities, Russia has remained focused on ensuring a second strike capability in the face of conventional counterforce capabilities, and focused on ensuring a first strike capability in the face of conventional inferiority in regional theaters. With regard to signaling, Russia's demonstrated its ability to retaliate and to strike first with nuclear or with conventional capabilities, increasingly in recent years. And with regard to declaratory strategy, this was an aspect of Russian strategy that was reduced, or the threshold for nuclear use was lowered in 2000, but that it was increased again from 2010 onwards and remains focused on nuclear weapons as weapons of last resort. I demonstrate that the significant autonomy of the Russian military and the significant autonomy the military enjoy in formulating nuclear policy. Civilian impact on strategy outcomes, it's not a constant, rather it's a rarity, and this pertains particularly to doctrine and declaratory policy. There is no civilian control or little civilian control of operational planning, strategic operations, and determining force requirements, leaving the detail to the military, which in turn means leaving critical decisions regarding the utility of nuclear weapons to state security to military strategists. And there is civilian control over parts of the procurement process, that is in terms of controlling the money, but again, the military industry has a significant push by themselves, and this triangular relationship between the industry, political decision makers, and military decision makers affects outcomes. The consequences of this significant military autonomy is this emphasis on the nuclear and conventional correlation of forces, almost obsessively so, which in turn means that the impact of conventional inferiority on nuclear strategy is sort of unprecedented and unappreciated in Western policy circles, which is what I've published an article on. Furthermore, the expanded conventional capabilities that Russia is now enjoying means a direct increase of the nuclear threshold, at least in terms of military operational planning and the concepts that are debated. And it explains also the very close approximation of nuclear and conventional military conceptualization and planning in Russia, also unprecedented as compared to the United States or others. And it means that Russia's approach to nuclear weapons is largely functional. They retain an emphasis on warfighting options as long as they exist. There is this saying that the Russians fight with what they have. Well, they have nuclear weapons plenty, and they will not give them up until they have other capabilities that can replace their military utility. So this book will make several contributions to the literature on nuclear strategy, military relations, and Russian decision-making regarding updating existing theories of conventional nuclear forces interaction and strategy interaction, regarding how civil-military relations impact the nuclear strategy outcomes. And it will also produce novel insights into the bureaucratic politics of security policy making in Russia and nuclear strategy formulation in Russia, undercutting the conventional wisdom regarding the Putin regime and how Putin sort of constitutes the Russia problem that the West is facing. Russian nuclear strategy, I demonstrate, will probably not change as a result of the end of the Putin regime, because Russian strategy has displayed this significant and remarkable continuity across the Yeltsin, Medvedev, Putin regimes. It means that a change in military perceptions of how nuclear weapons can serve Russian security will be necessary for true and transformational change of Russian nuclear strategy. All right, so I think I will end it there, and I am looking forward to your questions and comments and reactions.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I would just ask that you stop sharing your screen. It just makes the video a little easier, but floor is open. I see a number of hands up. We'll start with Vipin Narang. Vipin, I'm going to ask you to limit yourself to one question, because I suspect you're going to try to ask more.
No, I'll stick to one. Don't worry.
So one only, one per customer, yeah. Please.
Well, so Kristen, thanks for doing this. Great to see you. You know, I'm a huge fan of your work, and it's really important right now. Look forward to the book. The work on Russian nuclear strategy is a big lacuna since the end of the Cold War. I'm so glad you and Suzanne, who's one of our students here, is also interested in Russian nuclear strategy. And, you know, we have all these assumptions about Russian nuclear strategy as sort of the legacy of the Soviet capabilities and thinking. And it's increasingly clear that's not the case. I do have a lot of questions, but I will limit myself to one. So as you know, we've had this discussion before, but I'm curious, you know, as you're finishing the book, the United States and the Trump administration's 2018 nuclear posture review had a theory about Russian nuclear strategy that led it to propose and then deploy the low yield SLBM warhead, the W76-2. What did they get right and wrong about Russian nuclear strategy in sort of proposing that deployment? I mean, the idea and the proponents of it justify the low yield warhead, which would be mixed with higher yield W76-1s and W88s on the same submarine, on the theory that existing U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, the B-61 that were air delivered, were insufficient to deter Russian theater nuclear use. And so we need to be able to hold it at risk high value targets with a low yield primary only W76-2. Did they get sort of the theory right? And number two, how do the Russians view sort of that evolution, right? The proponents also said, if we launch, you know, a onesie, a single D5, the Russians won't react. They'll know it's low yield. They'll wait to see what hits and they won't react. And they may accept, you know, holding at risk, not just conventional forces or military targets in the theater, but high value targets, right? It's an SLBM that can range Moscow and pretty much anything in Russia. So I was wondering if we talk a little bit about that on both sides. Like, what do we get right and wrong, and how do the Russians view it? And, you know, are we reading them right about sort of their strategy and what it takes to deter Russian theater nuclear use in the, you know, everyone's favorite Baltic scenario?
Do you want me to respond, Professor Fravell, or do you want to collect?
Go ahead and respond.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I think what the US got right was the risk of Russian limited use of nuclear weapons, maybe not the point in conflict at which they would resort to those options, but the deterrent problem of seeking to deter Russian limited nuclear use, I think that they got right. What they didn't get right, I think, is that sort of a symmetrical capability on the US side would deter that type of limited nuclear use from the Russian side, or that a limited response or a symmetrical response would solve the problem in terms of forcing the Russians to back down. And I think this is quite evident from Russian strategy and its emphasis on these existential conditions which would have to be in effect in order for Russia to consider nuclear weapons use. That would mean that the moment Russia had used a nuclear weapon, they would deem the existence of the state as under threat, and so their use of nuclear weapons would basically convey a willingness to continue to escalate the situation. So I think those are the key issues with regard to that particular capability. The Russian response, as we talked about before as well, was on the face of it, well, now the US is contemplating a strategy of escalate to de-escalate. So, I mean, they were basically responding with the same sort of logic. And then, as you pointed to as well, a number of Russian officials started talking about the delineation problem and made also a number of official statements regarding how they would conceive of an incoming missile like that they would deem any nuclear capable missile as a nuclear missile upon the detection of such capability.
Great, thanks. So next, I'd like to go to Suzanne Freeman. Suzanne, over to you.
Good. Thank you so much, Taylor, for calling on me next. This was a really interesting talk. And I really, the changes in patterns of civilian control that you've outlined, I think are really interesting. And I'm curious if they extend beyond the nuclear space. But more specifically, I want to sort of highlight the fact that you've said that security forces have found themselves in positions of control sort of over the Russian military increasingly. And so with that in mind, sort of what role do security forces like the FSB have in determining nuclear strategy today? And do you see major differences in the way that those individuals might think about nuclear strategy compared to the general staff? And if they think differently, does it matter? Or are they really just sort of in a position of control, but not in a position of power to change the policy?
Yeah, thank you very much for a great question. And I mean, this is some of the material that I find the most interesting as well, including, I mean, I've examined the content of nuclear strategy and impact, civilian impact on nuclear strategy, but I'm also very curious about other aspects of military policy and whether these findings are generalizable, or I mean the mechanisms and patterns that I observe shouldn't necessarily only pertain to the nuclear domain. But I do think, well, having said that, I do think that there are particular aspects of the nuclear domain that produce this significant military autonomy in this particular domain, because it's a domain that's to some extent more inaccessible to other actors, such as, for example, the security forces. I think that your observation that the security forces are finding themselves in a situation of control, but without really necessarily having the tools for affecting change on the content of policy. I think that's a right. I think your gut feeling is right. I think that's a generally correct depiction of the situation. One of the problems that I'm facing is that it's much more difficult to trace the preferences of officials from the security forces than from the military, from the armed forces, from the general staff, in part because a lot of the staffers from the general staff, but also from the research institutes that are affiliated with the general staff, of course, write about these things in openly accessible or accessible journals and outlets, and whereas representatives from the security forces are not that expressive in the public domain. So So it's much easier to keep track of military actors, that is representatives from the armed forces, and then civilian actors, that is representatives from other parts of the civilian bureaucracy, or civilian strategists who are sort of part of the NGO think tank or semi-official civilian think tanks, whereas the preferences of the security forces are much more difficult to trace. But there are some interesting comparisons with regard to the Soviet period and some of the elements of the security forces control over the military forces in the Soviet period that can be used for comparison. And then it's an instance of this institution, the Security Council, which is in general staffed by people from the security forces, but also to some extent staffed by people from the armed forces. And where you look at the preferences of the actors who are coming into the process that takes place there, and then you look at the outcome coming out of the process. And for the cases that I've examined at least, I can see very little impact of any sort of third actor. I can trace almost every decision back to, in particular then, the military actors who have expressed their opinions in advance of this process. And so as far as I'm able to tell, the security forces, to the extent that they have preferences, they must either align very closely with those of the armed forces, or they do not necessarily have as precise and concrete preferences with regard to the actual content of nuclear strategy deliberate. I mean, particular decisions regarding, for example, the requirements placed on nuclear forces, or the types of forces that are necessary to produce an ability to inflict unacceptable damage, for example.
Great, thanks. So I think we have time for one more question in the public session. Let's see, Heather Williams, over to you.
Thanks, Taylor, and thanks, Kristen. It's really good to see you. You can probably guess my question is about what does this all mean for arms control, but I realize that that's like a meta question, so I'll try to scope it down just a little bit. Right, so on the one hand, as you say, you know, if the military is playing this dominant role, we know like historically, like Soviet military was pretty skeptical and opposed to arms control in a lot of situations. So you would think that your findings mean Russia would not be interested in arms control. But I actually think, you know, over the past 2 decades at least, Russia has shown a great interest in arms control. They don't always abide by it, but they're putting a lot of ideas out there. And so I'm kind of interested in if you found anything at least on the bureaucratic politics side of this. So is this a case where the military is suddenly more interested in arms control? Is it a cost savings thing? Or is this a case of Putin really wants arms control and the military just has to go along with it? But thanks again, this is a really great talk.
Thank you. I mean, I guess it depends a little bit on where you sit, whether or not you would say that that the evolution in the past decade or two has comprised of great achievements in the arms control arena. I think, as far as I've understood the preferences of a lot of Russian military actors, they've been absolutely happy with the reductions that have been agreed on, and that were sort of in line with the trajectory coming out of the 1990s. In the 1990s, there were some significant debates regarding, you know, the whole demerving and START 2 and issues like that. But with regard to New START, my impression has been that those reductions have been entirely in line with the preferences of military actors as well, that they have had absolutely no inhibitions regarding the reductions of strategic nuclear forces. And then if you move to military preferences regarding sub-strategic nuclear forces, my general impression would be that their preferences are largely in line with what seems to be the official Russian position as well, with regard to a willingness to negotiate on those types of issues. Same, I would say, pertains to the sort of relationship between offensive and defensive capabilities and the impact of missile defense on strategic stability. So I guess in my lexicon, I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, you have thought a lot more about this than me, but on the face of it, my impression would be that Russian preferences with regard to arms control are not necessarily that far away from the preferences of military actors who pay close attention to the correlation of conventional nuclear forces. But it may be that I have to examine this issue more closely. I do think that, I mean, I've talked about this significant military autonomy that I've observed in the cases that I've examined, but that's not to say that that couldn't change in the future in Russia. It's just that from the end of the Cold War and until now, as far as I can understand, Russian political authorities haven't been able to instill effective measures of civilian control. But that's not to say that that couldn't change in the future.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much. Thanks to everyone who has tuned in on YouTube. We'll now close sort of the public live streaming portion and